Well, hi everyone. Welcome. My name is Estefania, and on behalf of the DataSavesLives team, I would like to warmly welcome everyone to the first DataSavesLives webinar of the year on developing more meaningful health interventions through the use of patient-reported outcomes in health research. I will hand over now to Jess. Thank you, Jess, to do some housekeeping and introductions, and so that we can start off the presentations from our wonderful panelists. Welcome, everybody.
Thanks very much, Steph. And welcome to our expert speakers. The keen eyes among you will have seen that we're currently one expert panelist down, but hopefully he'll be joining shortly, and he's last in our running order of events. But yeah, the aims of today, and we're so glad that you're with us, are to help understand how patient groups can work with commercial and academic organisations to help shape clinical research that focuses on what really matters to patients. And our expert speakers today are going to highlight some successful examples of that collaboration and what has been the result from an outcomes perspective. In addition to learning about existing examples, we then have a large focus on discussion today to actually consider what are the current and what could be future opportunities to promote patient-led health data collection in clinical research as a primary point of discussion today, but also beyond what other research opportunities are there for patient outcomes to effectively lead the way. Now, on the next slide, we have a summary of our keynote speakers who are with us today. So a warm welcome to Hannah, Dr. Alexandra Wick and Dr. James Harmsworth King. I failed you, Alex, didn't I already? It's Wyke. Classic. This is how you know that it's live TV. But Hannah joins us from Roche today. So Hannah's the Principal Outcomes Research Scientist at Roche in the patient-centered outcomes research, so the specific PCOR team in their product development. So Hannah's been working in the field of patient-centered outcomes research for the last 8 years, specializing in the development, validation and interpretation of patient, caregiver, clinician and performance outcomes which meet industry and regulatory standards. As part of her role at Roche, she's responsible for activities in the area of spinal muscular atrophy and Duchenne muscular dystrophy, and it's actually an example from that world in SMA, spinal muscular atrophy, that she's going to be speaking today. Dr. Alex Wyke is the CEO and founder of Patient View, which aims to build bridges between patient advocacy movement and other stakeholders. So hopefully the range of you that we can see are on the call today. From 1996 to 2000, Alex was managing editor and creator of The Economist Intelligence Unit's International Healthcare Publishing section. So a great breadth of experience there. Before that, she was business and science correspondent for The Economist. So it's with that professional background that she brings to the patient view of understanding from a comms perspective what's relevant as well. Dr. James Harmsworth King, who has joined us now on the line, so just in the nick of time for his introduction, is the Chief Medical Officer and Biotechnology and Medical Expert at Evergreen Life. So James is an academic physician with over 10 years of clinical experience and a PhD in cardiac electrophysiology from the University of Cambridge, with his research into sudden cardiac death receiving numerous awards. James has consulted for several major pharmaceutical companies before he co-founded his own company, AngioSplice, a biotech that went on to win the Cambridge University Enterprise Competition for Best University Spin-Out that year. He's the co-founder of EOS Analytics, a health data collection analytics company in 2017, which was acquired by Evergreen, of whom he's speaking on behalf of, in 2019. So across that breadth, we have the industry view represented, the patient view represented, and the academic view represented. On the next slide, you can just see the order of the events. What are we covering today? We've got 10 minutes presentation from each of our speakers, in which we ask you to add questions into the chat function, because we will be regrouping on everyone's questions for all 3 presentations. as part of the open forum discussion at the end of each 10-minute presentation, where we have some questions up our sleeves, because I'm sure that the expert panelists are going to want to talk to each other and respond to each other's presentations for one, but also very much looking forward to covering what's of interest to you today. So please keep your questions coming as you think of them in the chat box. They will not go unnoticed. We can see all the chat function here, so we will return to them when we have the open forum discussion. So just a few housekeeping points. Now, I believe it's not relevant to you anymore because of the attendees and panelists Zoom, but for our speakers, just a reminder to keep on mute unless you're speaking, just to avoid any background noise. And the Q&A we've discussed, so if you might not be able to see the questions as an attendee, but we sure will, so don't worry about that. And now we're going to hand over the actual control of the screen, if we can, Steph, to our first speaker, Hannah Staunton, who's going to kick off with the industry perspective and the experience of Roche using patient-reported outcomes in the spinal muscular atrophy work.
Thank you, Jess. So firstly, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak with you all today. I'll be talking about developing meaningful patient-reported outcomes for use in clinical trials in rare diseases. And I'll be focusing on a case study in spinal muscular atrophy. So before I begin, I'd like to just state that any opinions or information given are based on general industry standards and not the opinions of Roche. And I'd also like to acknowledge all the individuals with spinal muscular atrophy and their families who have taken part in the studies that I'll be describing in this presentation. And of course, as well as that, the contributors and collaborators that you can see here listed on the slide. The work would not be possible without all these organisations. So I'll start by talking about the types of clinical outcomes assessments that are used in clinical trials to assess treatment benefit. And there are 4 types of clinical outcomes and possibly a 5th, which I'll come on to speak about. But we'll start with patient-reported outcomes, which come directly from the patient and obviously are our focus in today's webinar. So patient-reported outcomes are used when concepts are best known to patients. So for example, pain intensity is an example of a patient concept that is best known from a patient-centered perspective. In the middle, we've got observer-reported outcomes. So observer-reported outcomes come from an observer such as a caregiver that's not a healthcare professional and are appropriate, for example, in pediatric indications for caregivers to report, or for example, in indications where patients lack the capacity to provide self-report, and as such, a caregiver observer report may be more appropriate. We've also got clinician-reported outcomes, which come directly from a trained healthcare professional following observation of the patient. And in the top right-hand corner, performance-based outcomes. So performance-based outcomes are standardized tasks that are actively undertaken by a patient according to instructions. So examples of this would be something like the 6-minute walk distance or the timed up and go test performed by patients routinely in clinic. And more recently, we have a new type of clinical outcome assessment, which is being labelled patient monitoring COA. And this is where we can routinely monitor patients passively via, for example, a sensor or a wearable. But I'll focus today on patient-reported outcomes, and specifically patient-reported outcomes in rare diseases and the opportunities and the challenge that exist in this space. And the challenges relate to the fact that many patient-reported outcomes are generic and they're not well targeted necessarily to patients living with rare diseases. But there are many opportunities that do exist in this space. And if there's a willingness to engage in patient-reported outcome selection and development early in the drug development lifecycle, in partnership with the patient and the clinical community, this could mean that we have more relevant and sensitive patient-reported outcome measures and endpoints that really capture the concepts of importance to patients living with rare diseases. We have the opportunity to collaborate more closely with regulators and payers to really make sure that we're measuring what matters in rare diseases. We'll have more time to draw together the evidence that is needed to give stakeholders confidence in novel patient-reported outcome endpoints. And of course, ultimately, we'll have the opportunity to better meet the needs of the patient community living with the rare disease. So in rare diseases, targeted qualitative and quantitative data is needed to inform optimal patient-reported outcome development and selection. And I'll just briefly describe the steps that we go through to develop a patient-reported outcome for use in clinical trials. So we start with robust qualitative research to understand the symptoms and the impacts of importance in a given disease. And this is usually via literature reviews, if literature exists, but where literature does not exist, patient and caregivers semi-structured interviews which follow health authority guidance and methodology. We'll then take this evidence and look at whether existing patient-reported outcomes are adequate and whether they're adequately capturing the concepts of importance. And if they don't, we'll consider developing something new or adapting an existing measure. And throughout this process, we'll continue to get patient feedback and caregiver feedback and feedback from patient advocacy groups to really make sure that we're measuring the concepts that are important. Once we have the measure in place, either an existing PRO or something new or adapted, we can implement this in early stage clinical trials as exploratory outcomes. And this will involve other clinical outcome assessment data collection as well. And therefore, we can generate evidence documenting the psychometric measurement properties of the patient-reported outcome, which is a critical part of the development journey, where we can better understand the reliability, the validity, and the ability to detect change of the PRO. As well as this, we can look at what constitutes a meaningful change or a minimally clinically important difference in the patient population. And this is often determined using statistical methods, but also patient and caregiver input. And all of this culminates in a better understanding of the treatment effect in conjunction with other clinical outcome assessments. So for the rest of the presentation, I'll focus on a case study in spinal muscular atrophy. So spinal muscular atrophy is a rare genetic disease caused by a deficiency in SMN protein, which leads to progressive muscle weakness and loss of motor function. And its phenotypic spectrum is classically divided into 4 subtypes. So 1 being the most severe SMA type, 3 to 4 being the least severe. But the symptoms and the impacts are very variable depending on SMA type. So we have progressive motor function weakness, difficulties completing everyday activities, and in more severe cases, difficulties swallowing as well as respiratory difficulties. So this heterogeneous impact of SMA makes selecting clinical outcomes challenging. But typically in clinical trials, we focus on assessing motor function by clinician-reported outcomes that typically focus on achieving motor milestones. But a need did exist to develop a relevant and a sensitive patient-reported outcome measure to focus on the concept of daily living and difficulties completing everyday activities for use in the type 2-3 SMA population in clinical trials. So now I'll describe the process we went through to develop this patient-reported outcome. And it started with qualitative semi-structured interviews with patients and caregivers in the US and the UK. And what you can see there in the small icon is the result of this work, which was the development of a conceptual model. So a conceptual model is a visual depiction of the disease experience that comes from the patient perspective, so the symptoms and impacts that are experienced. And this work involved other industry collaborators, it involved clinical experts, and also patient advocacy groups, including Cure SMA and SMA Europe, who are involved in the study to identify patients and ensure the appropriate interpretation of the results. But what was clear from this research was that the concept of independence was critical for individuals living with type 2 and 3 SMA. And so we set about looking for a patient-reported outcome that could capture this concept, and were not able to find an adequately targeted measure for this population. And as a result, we developed a scale that's called the SMA Independence Scale, or the SMACE for short. And we ran a series of patient and caregiver interviews and subsequently incorporated this measure in a clinical trial called Sunfish Part 2. And here we included a patient-reported outcome for individuals aged 12 and older, and a caregiver-reported outcome for individuals aged 2 and older. And from this clinical trial, we were able to test the measurement properties of the instrument in terms of its psychometrics. And we were also able to generate patient and caregiver reported evidence of the treatment effect that could go alongside the other clinical outcome assessments, such as the ClinRose that were included in the study. So you may be wondering what is included in this SMACE, and this visual shows the key domains. So we have bathing and hygiene items, items around dressing, eating and drinking, picking up and moving small objects, and hand dexterity. And the measure itself is focused on the level of assistance a patient needs to complete these activities. And when we ran our patient and caregiver studies, we heard from families that the measure included the important concepts and that it was readily understood by patients and caregivers completing the tool. And when we included this in our clinical trial and conducted appropriate psychometric testing, we derived a 22-item total score, with higher scores being associated with better ability or greater function in completing activities of daily living. And we've since gone on to share this measure with some updates based on our psychometric work. So it's now available for broader patient, clinical, and community use. So I'd like to close by just talking briefly about some of the opportunities for learnings from this work. And the first is to say that novel patient-reported outcome development needs to occur as early as possible in the drug development life cycle. As you can see on the prior slide, we started in 2016, but it takes many years to run the appropriate patient studies and the appropriate psychometric tests. As well as this, we have an opportunity to collaborate with other stakeholders. So the first study I described was as the result of collaboration with 5 other industry sponsors, a clinical outcome assessment partner, 2 clinical experts, and patient advocacy groups. So we've got the opportunity to avoid duplicative qualitative research. And finally, the concept of interest needs to be relevant across a broad population. And this is particularly challenging in rare diseases where you have heterogeneous symptoms and impacts. But what we found from our research was that maintaining independence was key, and therefore we were able to develop an outcome that could capture change in our weakest patients, but also our strongest patients as well. So to conclude, patient and caregiver input is critical in the development and the selection of patient-reported outcomes, and this is in order to ensure that we assess meaningful concepts which meet appropriate standards. And early and systematic involvement of patients and caregivers and patient organisations is critical, and this must be sustained. So input to the design, the conduct, and the interpretation of the results that surround patient-reported outcome generation. And I'll close by once again thanking all the patients and all the collaborators who made this research possible. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hannah. That was a great presentation. And I think in 10 minutes, you've achieved a lot just to explain the how that Roche has done it so successfully. And I think in our questions, not least among them, will be finding out what was the impact of that in terms of drug approvals, getting it through regulation, and why involving patients is so important from that standpoint. Just a reminder to all audience members that will be asking these questions of Hannah and the rest of the panel when we have our group discussion at 12:40 GMT or 13:40 CET. So that's when we're going there. I'll hand over to Dr. Alex Wyke now, who's going to talk more about how patient view can be incorporated into pharma research and development, and looking at a patient-centered toolkit to achieve this. So Alex, I'll hand over to you now.
All right, I thought that Hannah's talk, it was just exactly the sort of things that we picked up in the work that we've been doing. Fantastic example. So Patient View is an organization that really just surveys patient organizations rather than patients. And as part of our brief, we've been looking at ways that pharmaceutical companies can be more patient-centric, because obviously that is one of their goals. As part of all this process, we've looked at the specific examples of patient engagement in pharma R&D. Now, one of the reasons that we've done that is, although this is research from 2018-2019, we've just completed research in 2020-21, and the figures are virtually the same, that 80% of patient groups worldwide, and typically the numbers in our surveys are approaching 2,000, tell Patient View that pharma is only fair or poor at engaging patients in R&D. But as we know, the pharmaceutical companies want to be more patient-centric across the board, including at an R&D level. And after all, R&D is the engine that drives the pharmaceutical industry. And as we know that patients and patient groups regard R&D as a very important part of the whole pharmaceutical process because it gives patients hope, But at the same time, patient groups are putting the whole R&D process under greater scrutiny to try and understand its ins and outs. So this relates to work that we did in 2017 and 2018, though I'll just do a quick update at the end. And it involved about 2,000 patient organizations worldwide. And one of the reasons we choose patient groups is that we feel that they're a very exceptional stakeholder because they're the only stakeholder in healthcare to network with every single other stakeholder in healthcare. And they also are unique because they understand patient needs, but they also can express them and translate them for pharmaceutical companies. So pharmaceutical companies can act in a way that's meaningful to the company. So they are a fantastic resource. The three areas we looked at in this research was firstly, what sort of aspects of R&D do patients want to be involved in as expressed by patient organizations? How should, in those areas, how should pharmaceutical companies improve their patient centricity? And then finally, we put together a sort of toolkit for the pharmaceutical industry so that they can be more patient-centric in R&D to support that whole endeavor. So just a quick overview of the results is that in all the phases of R&D, right from the beginning where you're determining unmet patient needs, as Hannah described, through to when we withdraw the products from the market, patients want to be involved in every single step. And just to give you an example, and this is just sort of the headlines, at each step, some examples of what was said. This again echoes what Hannah said, is that when you are deciding what areas to investigate as a pharmaceutical company, it's very important that you try and explore treatments that patients want, not that they don't want. And so one example we were made aware of is fatigue in rheumatism, because that was something not necessarily identified by clinicians. But Hannah gave another example about independence, stigma is another one. And so there are all sorts of needs that patients are very aware of in their day-to-day life that may not emerge in discussions with clinicians. Now, having decided which areas you're going to focus on, then you have to decide which patient populations you're going to test or you employ in your clinical trials, which technology platforms. And clearly, patient groups want clinical research to be as broad as possible and meaningful to them as individuals, because often as not, the clinical trial doesn't bear a resemblance to the patient that is who goes to see their doctor. They've got comorbidities, etc. So that it's very important that the clinical data is as relevant as possible to the real clinical setting. Then once you start conducting clinical trials, obviously patients want to not only help define endpoints, outcomes, but they want to be involved in the trial design, and particularly in the ethical aspects of trial design. And one example again that was given to us was about children with cancer. How often do you take a biopsy in clinical trials? You don't want to take them too often, but what is the optimum? And to discuss this with patient groups or patients. Then you have to build evidence for regulatory authorities, and patient groups want to contribute to that evidence and have a voice there, which many already do with many regulatory authorities. Sorry, I'll just take a drink.
Cool.
Then we have the drug reimbursement, where patients feel that they have a contribution to make. And again, there's a lot of work in this area, and particularly with patients with life-threatening conditions where the patients feel they can take a greater risk than probably the HTA authorities believe. Then there's collecting real-world evidence and sharing experiences about what it's like to be on this treatment, and possibly other populations that could use the treatment, having had the clinical trial approval, and perhaps broaden it to a wider range of the population, and then patients can contribute to that. And lastly, we come to the point when the product has reached the end of its lifetime, but of course the products are valued by those patients, and therefore patients feel they should be involved as how those products should be withdrawn from the market. So this is just the headline examples. Just to give you an idea of some of the things that the patient said, I won't read all of them because of the time, but just to take a couple of examples. Patients sometimes are willing to take more risks than regulatory bodies and or industry are daring to consider. That was a national cancer patient group from Lithuania. Ease the transition when a medication goes off exclusivity labels so that patients can still get the drug. And that's a national neurological conditions patient group from the USA. And these are just 6 out of thousands of comments that we receive and categorize so that we can get a very clear picture of what it is that these patient groups feel they can contribute. So this slide is probably far too complex from Zoom, but it's just the headlines that we've picked up about the processes that go on in R&D right through the whole cycle and what the headlines are that patient groups think are important. But in doing so and having categorized it, we then go back and then develop a toolkit which consisted, in this case, of 128 questions, which were formulated with the support of patient group evidence to act as a checklist for pharma, saying, am I doing this? Am I doing this? According to what the patient groups have defined. So it gives you a sort of interaction with the patient group world at a very broad level and a sort of feeling within the company that are they along the right track in being patient-centric with R&D. And my final slide really has to do with the COVID pandemic, because that's changed everything. And the roles of the vaccines and the way that regulators and government and pharma are working together, the vaccine rollout has had a big, profound change in the way that R&D is possible. And this is from the most recent studies that we've been doing. And just again, not to read everything again, headline things of feedback that patient groups have given us, saying what they feel should happen as a result of COVID in non-COVID chronic diseases. And that's the accelerated R&D, to learn how that happened in COVID and perhaps translate it to other treatments. One of the things that patient groups patients really liked, according to patient groups, was that treatments that had to be delivered in hospital were adapted for the home. And so perhaps in future, many more treatments could be delivered in a home instead of the patient having to trot along to the hospital. Remote participation, which we'll probably hear from James about, the patients really, and patient groups enjoyed that. And the importance of real world evidence, which was quite stunning how we had the clinical trials with how the vaccines should be given out. And then after real world evidence was collected, those clinical circumstances changed. And so this shows you the importance of real world evidence in the whole equation, and that patients are very keen to participate in that. And that is me. And I wanted to thank again, like Anna, everyone, all the patient groups that participate in our survey, and also to DataSavesLives for letting us have our slot. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Another absolutely fascinating presentation delivered in these 10-minute chunks. We weren't sure that everyone was going to be able to actually go into deep enough detail before the discussion, but in fact so many different points have been raised here, many of which I immediately want to touch on, but I'm going to resist the urge. I think actually the point around COVID and how that's changing how we collect data and input on trials segues very nicely to our last expert presentation from Dr. James Hazelwood-King, who's talking about the Evergreen app, but a lot of the information can translate beyond that to apps in general, and how we've all become a lot more accustomed to sharing where we are and how we're feeling because of the pandemic. But I think there are many more exciting applications than that. So I'll hand over to you, James, to talk about what those might be.
Thank you, Jessica. And just, to build on what Alex and Hannah are talking about, which is essentially this patient-centered approach to research. To segue into Evergreen, which is essentially about people-powered health. And to me, the two are very similar. And hopefully what I'll do is spend the next 10 minutes just explaining Evergreen's approach to health and well-being and research. And then if we have time, maybe give a few use cases, including COVID. So Evergreen is a B Corp corporation, which means its principal investors are all social impact. It was started 2 or 3 years ago as a personal health record, so an app that all patients can carry around their health record in their pocket. So if they're going abroad or they go to a new GP or a new hospital, they have all their information with them. We now have about 850,000 users in the UK who, over the last year, have completed about 1 million questionnaires, which cover a number of PROs on health, diet, and fitness. Plus, they've entered their own allergies, medications, and conditions into their medical record. They also have the ability to link with their GP record and download what the GP has in that record and carry that everywhere. And about 500,000 of them have done that. And they also have the ability to get genetic testing to add to that data set to try and use that information to create subsequent health and well-being related content. When the app started, the questionnaires were formed internally by a panel of experts, and the questions we were asking were all focused about ways that we could prevent disease by getting more information about health and well-being, and they're all fairly basic questionnaires. We then, which are essentially patient-reported outcomes, we then moved on to bringing in clinician reported outcomes from the GP record, so things like conditions, medications, allergies, that kind of thing. And then now we are interfacing with data aggregators like HealthKit and Fitbit to bring in these passive reported outcomes. So things like wearables from Apple Watch and so on. We have 10 or 20 different partnerships in various stages of the grant application process with about 10 or 12 different universities looking at a range of different diseases and health conditions. And the way we work with universities is we offer exactly the same app that our patients use, except if the patients can opt in to certain studies. And that could be because they have diabetes or they have spinal atrophy, in the case we heard from Hannah earlier. And when they do that, they get a link or a QR code, which essentially tags them as a user in the app as part of this study. They're consented by the academics. And then the academics themselves can choose exactly what PROs or passive reported outcomes or clinician reported outcomes they require for their study, and then follow that up with additional interventions, be them a face-to-face appointment or some form of diagnostic or indeed testing. Now the way, and this is a bit of a generalization, but the way that the conventional clinician-centered approach to research looks a bit like this, where you have a clinician sitting in the middle of the process with the patient and basically acting as a conduit for the patient to get involved into research. And then the researcher is kind of out in the end, and the researcher does have to have a dialogue with the patient in terms of consenting and recruiting. The researcher also has to have a dialogue with the clinician. And then both the clinician and the researcher have to navigate all the different places where we put the relevant data. And this is, I think, especially true in the UK, where we do have a really complex system in terms of access and consent to accessing various forms of records. So it can be very difficult to navigate, even if that is your full-time job. But you can imagine if you're a patient sitting out here, how would you ever find out about your social care record or what's actually in your medical record? It's unbelievably difficult to do. And what that ultimately leads to is really inefficient research. You know, we're at a stage, you know, even before the pandemic, where we're used to using geopositioning and, you know, wearables, you know, for dating and for banking, but we're not really applying that to research, and we're not really applying that to drug development. And this is just to element the different kind of data silos that are currently being held with the focus on research. If we look at the way that we approach a problem, we put the user, the patient, bang in the middle of the conversation. And that's great for the user because it gives complete transparency, but also gets them pivotal to the setup and the development and the ongoing trials as they happen. It also is much more efficient for both the researcher and the clinician because they can just have single points of dialogue with the patient as opposed to multiple different stakeholders. As we can see, the other benefit is all the data and the access to the data is owned by the user. So we don't own any of the data. The data is all owned by the user in their personal health record. The user can then consent to academics and researchers to access that for various trials if they would like to. And fundamentally, that's what we believe is right. But beyond that, it also gives huge advantages to the researchers because they just go to one place to access the records, be them health, social care, or 23andMe, or whatever it is. And that's all held in the PHR. So we went live with our research partnerships, as so happens, in January 2020, and started working initially with the universities of Liverpool and Manchester, just as COVID began. So the first use case for us in terms of a disease state was COVID, but it may well have been diabetes or heart failure or any number of other conditions we're currently looking at. But what it meant was we were the first app in the UK to start tracking using PRO's compliance and symptom burden data on COVID. And in the early stages, this is before Zoe, there was very little data on this. So the evergreen users were able to feed that data at the time to the NHS and Public Health England via Oasis, which was a project that was put together. And we were able to feed that back to our users and to the centre to help guide policy. And these are just some visualizations, both geographically and along a timeline about how those two things have changed during the period of the crisis. Now, in addition to this, we also have those millions of questionnaire answers on diet and fitness and lifestyle, and also all those millions of data points from the GP record. So we're able to start asking questions about how things like compliance behavior and COVID symptom burden can be correlated to those lifestyle behaviors, for example, or certain GP diagnoses. But before we get that, because we were in the early stages, there were lots of questions about validating self-reported patient responses. People were like, well, how does a patient know if they have COVID symptoms? How do they know if they're compliant with the regulations? So we did a number of exercises. Here we have a plot of our compliance data in green. So this is the percentage of evergreen users who are compliant with government guidance over time. And then in the purple, we have the percentage utilization of the national rail, which should be 100%. And clearly that dropped to almost zero with the early stages of COVID. And you can see how it exactly mirrors national rail usage with compliance to national guidance. So using data displays like this, we're able to assure the centre and academics that patients are able and very capable of reporting outcome measures themselves. Another common question we get is, well, surely it's just young, privileged people who use apps. You know, this isn't really going to get to the people that we really need to target to help prevent some of these diseases. And we're able to come back with some very strong data that we've benchmarked against ONS in terms of age, gender, ethnicity, and deprivation that shows that we do actually have a really representative user base that covers the vast majority of the country. And the part where it gets really interesting, and depending on how much time we have, I can go into more detail on this, is what we do with that data. Because just tracking PROs over time and tracking PROs over geographically is useful, but it doesn't really help answer the questions about, well, how can we do better next time? What can we do to prevent people perhaps potentially from having worse outcomes if we were to have a fourth and a fifth and a sixth wave of COVID? So using our other data sources from those questionnaires and from the GP record, we're able to do things like this. So this is a fairly simple analysis looking for correlations across different data buckets for users who have reported that they've had COVID symptoms over the past whatever period it is. And from this, we can start to see certain patterns. And we start to see that people who have jobs that are causing them a lot of anxiety, people who drink a lot of alcohol, people who perhaps have poor diets tend to report symptoms more regularly. as opposed to people who are exercising and are eating well. One of the strongest signals we've had in our data is about anxiety. And I thought I'll just finish on this graph, because I think this is really striking. And we've seen anxiety peak during COVID across all age groups at the start of the pandemic, and then drop and follow this kind of pattern with each lockdown. And we can, if we have time, we can go into more detail about how lockdowns affect anxiety and other determinants of health. But the thing that's really interesting that's happened recently is young people, and this is something that's very close to my heart, which is the damage COVID is doing to young people, not because of the health outcome, because of the impact on employment and education and all these other things. And what we're seeing since the vaccine rollout in December, that all the eligible groups, anxiety has been dropping to the floor to an all-time low. So people who are in their 50s and 70s who have had or eligible for the vaccine are no longer anxious. However, the younger groups are not only continuing to be anxious, their anxiety is increasing in certain groups. And for me, definitely this is a really important thing that definitely needs some more work. And we are working with universities to try and understand exactly why this population has got increasing anxiety. Because what our data definitely shows is that anxiety is a very key determinant of health outcomes, and breaking that down into actual actionable lifestyle change is going to be key to preventing some of these conditions in the long run. What I might do there, Jessica, is just end it there. But if anyone is interested, there are a few more graphs and visualizations about the data.
Thanks very much, James. No, that was brilliant. And yes, I think rounded it off nicely in terms of looking at the digital tools and the power of those, particularly when it comes to tracking outcomes that previously have not been studied in traditional research, but are meaningful indicators of health and positive health outcomes like anxiety, as you mentioned. Now, this is the discussion portion for the next 40 minutes. So we're going to have a discussion with all of our panelists. We've received many questions already, which I'll be making my way through on the side. Obviously, please feel free to use the Q&A function, the chat function, to add more questions, and not to worry if you don't hear a question immediately. It will be reached, or some of you have asked similar questions, so hopefully we'll cover those together. Now, James, because you were just in the hot seat, it probably makes sense for me to ask a couple of questions directed to you from the outset before we return to some of the presentation content that Hannah and Alex covered. So James, to kick off with, I suppose looking at how the patient-reported outcomes measures are collected via the app, as it's remote versus a clinical trial, do you see a drop-off in terms of the same people responding, so for academic research compared to a traditional trial, or what's your take on that?
So the vast majority of our data is just from our users. So these aren't individuals who have self-selected to be recruited to a trial. So we would expect their responses to be less frequent than those in a normal trial. And yet we see people, so with our COVID stuff, we have about 100,000 users who have been reporting, God bless them, their COVID symptoms and compliance for coming up to 2 years now. And these are people who are not incentivized in any way to do this, other than the content they get and the guidance and so on, and the visualizations. In the studies that we have with academics, we haven't got sufficient data yet to see whether that response rate is higher, but we would imagine it would be, because if users are saying, yes, I do have spinal atrophy, and I am very keen to find a cure, they are going to be much more motivated to respond to remote PROs, that I would imagine, than other users.
That's really helpful. I suppose it touches on another question we've got through, which is, what is that motivation? You say there's no other driver other than the visuals and the apps. Do you share any other kind of feedback of the value of their participation for wider societal benefit, for example?
Absolutely. And I mean, if you would like to have a look, do download the app. It's completely free. It's all funded via the NHS revenues through booking appointments and things. But absolutely. So the idea is when you answer these questions, it gives you personalized content based on not just your answers, but the answers of the community. So it's people like you who could be 50-year-old men who have diabetes and are on this medication tend to get better BMI outcomes if they go with this diet. Now that's a very precise example, but it gives you an idea of the kind of content that can be personalized when people participate in this. But it could also just be with COVID stuff. It's just, this is the local guidance near you. This is how you book a test, just really basic content. And from a research perspective, the same is true. So the PIs of the studies can pick how personalized they want that subsequent content to be. And this is where it gets quite tricky, because if you personalize content sufficiently, you could argue that becomes an intervention. And then suddenly you're in a situation where you're not doing an observational study. You actually should really be randomizing and blinding people if you are going to be doing an intervention. So with the research, that it's a bit more complicated, but definitely for our users, what they get back is this personalized information that makes them part of the community to help nudge them towards lifestyle change that could improve their health and hopefully prevent diseases in the long term.
Thanks, James. And there has been a lot of evidence, as you say, about the value of journaling actually your health symptoms and that nudge theory in order to have more positive lifestyle choices on a day-to-day basis. I mean, the point that you're making around the more specific we go in targeted population ties into another question we've got from one of our attendees today, which is, what's the average sample size considerations if you're looking into research at this level? And actually, James, you might want to answer that, or Hannah and Alex, open to you as well. What kind of guidelines do you follow here in terms of determining what is significant?
I don't know if I want. It completely depends on what outcome measure you're looking at. It can be very small. So we're looking at, for example, a study on pharmacogenetics, where you basically do a genetic test to look how your body metabolizes different drugs. And then we select users who are on those drugs. In this case, it's antidepressants. And because that is so personalized and the outcome is so strong, i.e., do they get side effects? Are they switched from different drugs? We only need 5,000 to 10,000. However, some of the stuff we were talking about just now about anxiety, where the actual outcome, the change is perhaps not so measurable, you need much larger sample sizes. But I'm sure Hannah and Alex can give more specifics in terms of drug development and powering studies and this kind of thing.
Yeah, so I think in terms of qualitative studies where we're trying to decide what to measure and the concepts to measure, there's various different sources in terms of what's an acceptable sample size, but you're always striving to achieve what we call conceptual saturation, so the point at which no new concepts emerge. And if you've got a very homogeneous group in terms of their clinical characteristics and demographic characteristics, then you can do this potentially in as few as 15 to 20 interviews. But clearly we rarely have a homogeneous group, and we usually have many different age ranges and clinical profiles. And as a result, those interviews do increase more often than not. In terms of psychometrics, and testing of a patient-reported outcome, it really depends on the type of analysis you're doing. So we do various analyses in terms of data reduction techniques to decide how we score a measure, such as factor analytic techniques versus item-level descriptive statistics. So there's not one single number. Clearly, bigger sample sizes are far superior in terms of looking at psychometrics. And then in terms of clinical trials and how we power clinical trials, we really have to think at the start of the study about the amount of variability that you might expect in the measure that you're looking at as your primary outcome, but also the meaningful change that you would expect to see on the outcome. And it's the balance between these that helps you decide the appropriate sample size. And that's driven by our statistical experts.
Thanks, Hannah. I mean, you've just pointed on a few of the things. There's a huge amount to consider when it comes to powering a clinical trial in a way that means that it should see an intervention, if it's successful, demonstrate that but also should see it through the regulatory process so that other people can appreciate the value too. And I think that is the challenge when it comes to how we bridge the gap between the confidence and statistical experts who have traditionally designed trials and actually involving the community perspective. So a question that we have as a follow-up for you, Hannah, is in what ways were patients or patient organisation involved in shaping the SMA trial? Is this just in providing insights, or are they also potentially looking at these interview questions that you mentioned and validating the scores that are used?
Yeah, it's a great question. And in terms of the specific work that I was involved in regarding the patient-reported outcome, the patients and the patient advocacy groups were primarily involved in the interpretation, and clearly patients were involved as research participants. But in more recent work that we've been doing on the SMA independent scale in a different population, we have patient advocacy groups involved right from the start in terms of designing the protocol, appropriate inclusion, exclusion criteria that's realistic and that's feasible, right the way through to helping design the most appropriate interview guide questions, and then of course collection, interpretation of the subsequent results. And that's really the most appropriate model, so that patient organisations are involved as experts. And what we try to do is involve a range of experts, patient experts, clinical experts, statistical experts, and bring everybody together to have that panel that helps guide the research that we conduct.
Thanks, Hannah. And based on those measures, how readily are you seeing regulatory authorities accept those patient-crafted outcomes as potential substitutes or additions to the more traditional clinical ones that we've seen?
So that really depends on the disease area and the level of evidence that's been generated for the patient-reported outcome and its positioning in terms of clinical trial endpoints. So for novel patient-reported outcomes, a lot of work needs to be done across many different studies. So there's all the work that I was describing in terms of how you develop, but then validation needs to be replicated across numerous different sources. So it's a high hurdle in terms of patient-reported outcomes acceptance. But there are patient-reported outcomes that have been used in studies as primary and secondary endpoints for key decision-making. So these case studies do exist. But clearly for anything novel that's newly created, there's a lot of work that needs to be done before the patient-reported outcome would be considered as a key factor in decision-making. It can, of course, provide complementary evidence to other clinical outcome assessments that have been validated and used systematically.
And when something hasn't been studied before, I mean, the SMAE scale, the spinal muscular independence scale that you developed at Roche, is there room to develop tools like that across a number of sponsors who are both developing treatments in the same area? Do you see that as something that industry can work on together?
Yeah, absolutely. Industry collaborations are certainly a key part of developing outcomes. And there are consortium efforts that bring together sponsors that are working in the same area. So, for example, there is the Critical Path PRO Consortium, who focus on cross-industry collaborations where there's a shared interest in a given disease area to do that work together. So those types of collaborations do exist and absolutely are beneficial in terms of avoiding duplicate research and avoiding multiple outcomes being developed in the same space. So yes, they do exist, and there are many collaborators that are involved in those types of initiatives.
Thanks, Hannah. I suppose that actually goes partway to answering another question we've received from the audience, which is about when you're looking at commercial entities like pharmaceutical companies developing these scores. Obviously, in part, they're driven by brand strategy. How can we define that this product works better and on what scales? How do we manage that versus the greater good? Do you see any tension there? But for example, looking at different shades of clinical differentiation, which don't necessarily address the wider patient priorities, but are necessary to get through those regulatory hurdles, which you say are set very high.
So what it really comes back to is asking the patients first what's important to them and what we should be measuring, as I described in our study, and starting that work very early in the life cycle so that we can make sure that the outcomes that are included in our trials are focused on the patient priorities. So for me, that's the place to start. And as I said, the earlier, the better. You know, with patient-reported outcomes, it's really starting in the preclinical or early phase clinical trials to design these measures based on patient insights and based on what matters most to patients, to avoid what you described in terms of developing very specific or niche patient-reported outcomes that aren't actually driven by patient priorities.
Thanks, Hannah. No, that's great. And it's great to see all the investment that Roche has put into this field of research, really, and making sure that the trials are powered in this way. It's probably a nice segue to return back to you, Dr. Alex, in terms of the studies there and the patient group's view on how well pharma as a whole is achieving this and in the way that patient-reported outcomes are incorporated. A couple of the questions that we have from the audience around the patient view survey were based on who's involved. Is it just strictly patient organisations, or also those patient experts and influencers who still play a leading role in the community but aren't necessarily affiliated with a particular organisation?
The vast majority are patient organisations because we want representation of patients. Individuals just represent themselves, although they are experts. We do have the odd patient expert, but on the whole, we do seek out patient groups because they're the ones that actually interact with pharma and therefore are able to articulate best what it is that pharma needs to do to make them the R&D more patient-centric.
But thanks for that. I think in terms of patient community and how it's being mobilised, a lot of expert patients are now representing wider communities, not just their own opinion, but very much appreciate that distinction there between an individual sharing their personal lived experience and professional organisations, which by default are there to represent a wider community. In terms of addressing that commercial aspect and the tension there that Hannah discussed, is that something that you've explored with your members as to how PROs are being developed and whether those developments should be cross-industry rather than with individual pharmaceutical companies?
To some extent, because what we did, it's actually some interesting work we did many years ago. It was with Novo Nordisk, looking at quality of life. And what we tried to do was we did a big survey of patient organizations to try and define what it is that actually make up what patients think is a good quality of life. And it was in all that time when Cameron had quality of life, happiness indexes, all that sort of stuff. We came down and found there were about 39 variables, and that we started sharing that data with other companies. And yes, it was very interesting. But that type of research, quality of life, I don't know, Hannah may know more what's happened to that, but as far as I know, it hasn't gone much further in the last few years.
Thanks, Alex. Well, I'll let the other two experts comment on that. I suppose adding to that question is it appropriate that quality of life is included in some way as a measure in all health research projects?
I think that one of the most interesting things, in fact, it was the former CEO of EPF, who said that if you want patients to comply, it's a very good idea early on that the treatment is something that they want and something that they've been engaged with right from the start. So I think it is a very good idea. And I'm not 100% sure I answered your question, but we feel that patient involvement and patient-centeredness is, to use a very cliche term, win-win. So yes, I think that it's something that should be done.
Absolutely. And Hannah, did you want to add whether quality of life would be appropriate for many clinical trial programs, if not all?
Yeah, I was just going to add in here and say, yes, absolutely. Quality of life is important. I think the big challenge with quality of life outcomes is that often they're generic. And by generic, I mean not necessarily developed for a specific disease area. And so in my case study around rare diseases, it becomes very hard with some quality of life tools because the concepts are quite distal, and as a result can be influenced by many factors, because under quality of life, you have emotional, psychological, social constructs. And so they can become very large instruments and also not specifically targeted to a disease area. Now, in some cases, this is appropriate to have a generic quality of life measure. So, for example, for the calculation of utilities, many HTAs and payers want to see generic health-related quality of life outcomes included, such as the EQ5D or the Health Utilities Index. These types of measures are very helpful sometimes and are needed for certain stakeholders like HTAs and payers. But as I said, it's just this need to be cautious around this type of data, given it's not always specific to the population of interest.
Thanks, Hannah. And to create something that is specific to the population of interest, how long does that process take? What's involved for industry now thinking, oh gosh, if anyone's attending this webinar or watching it afterwards, we better get a patient-reported outcome measure in our trial. What does that look like in terms of integrating it into protocol design?
Yeah, it can take a long time to do the relevant studies in terms of starting with the literature reviews. First of all, seeing whether anything's out there. I mean, clearly we want to try use outcomes that exist and have been validated as far as possible, or potentially it's adapting a measure. You know, a measure might be there or thereabouts, and if you work with a developer or the license holder, there may be a way to adapt it to make it fit for purpose. And then I think if there is really nothing that can be adapted, that's when you might consider developing something new and really starting with all that qualitative work I described. And usually we develop what's called a conceptual framework, which outlines all the items that might be included and their associated relationships, including any domains that exist. And you ensure that qualitatively you've got the right concepts, and then you go through all the statistical testing I mentioned. And the statistical testing takes different forms, but firstly, you want to see that cross-sectionally at a single time point, you are able to have reliable and valid data, and you don't see, for example, extremes in items that are very easy for everybody in your population or maybe far too difficult in your population, this type of testing. And then it's about the longitudinal data collection and about understanding the change over time on the outcomes. But this work can take a long time, and there are existing health authority standards that need to be followed for the generation of this data. So it's a multi-staged approach, and starting, the earlier you start, the better.
And do you see the increase in use of apps like the one that James describes as having a huge user base, but in the UK since the start of COVID? Do you see, if that were used over time, that those kind of apps might become part of traditional clinical research models?
Yeah, so in clinical trials, we often have electronic clinical outcome assessments, or ECOA for short, where you're collecting patient-reported outcomes on an electronic device. And again, standards exist for this type of research as well, ensuring the appropriate incorporation of PROs onto devices. And it's a way clearly to get more regular intervals of data, which can be extremely helpful. And as well as that, it can help us with missing data. For example, if you can have an edit check that tells the patient you skipped an item, did you mean to skip this item? You can understand more about your missing data as well, that clearly with a paper and pen administration, you can't. So there are definitely benefits to the applications and to having PROs, as well as other different types of outcomes that James was describing in terms of more wearable and passively collected data, as well as ClinRose through this process as well.
Thanks, Hannah. I suppose, so James, to segue to you off the back of Hannah's answer there, how do you see apps like Evergreen, but also similar apps that are collecting that kind of daily regular data being used beyond just clinical research, but informing potentially national healthcare policies and public health campaigns?
I honestly think more than ever after COVID, it's the only way we're going to going to get on top of these backlogs, pick up the probably millions of people who have failed to attend cancer screening, for example, or failed to attend their NHS health checks. And I do think the low-hanging fruit is putting all these PROMs or PROs on an app in an electronic format and making sure they're in someone's pocket and you don't have to phone them up to get them to report. But I think the real efficiencies and economies of scale come when you start kind of changing your thinking a little bit from the way we worked, from going from gold standard physical and psychometric questionnaires, which have to be used in a certain way by a certain person in order for them to be validated, and start asking questions about, well, can we use the accelerometer in the phone to measure something? Can we use GPS? Can we use some clever analysis? And the example I always think of about this is it comes down to health checks. We were doing a project with a CCG in London about a digital health check, and I don't know how many people on the call have had a health check, but some of the questions they ask is a gold standard physical activity questionnaire called the GP Physical Activity Questionnaire. And it asks a bunch of questions, and patients usually respond to the GP or the nurse asking them those questions, but we digitize them, put them on the phone, and the patient self-reported. But we also, in the background, track their activity. So every single one of those questions that the patient self-reported, we were tracking what they were actually doing. And a lot of these questions about how often do you stop when you walk, what's your average walking speed, how often are you going to the park, and completely understandably, when that questionnaire was developed, there wasn't the technology to be able to do that. And interestingly, what we found is that although we were getting increased uptake from the traditional patient-reported outcome perspective, we were also getting different results when we actually tracked what users were doing. They were getting their speeds wrong. They were getting their stopping distances wrong. And I do think then there is a change coming where we can not just believe patients can report their own outcomes accurately, but also we can embrace technologies to do it. And I think COVID will help with that, as we've seen definitely in primary care with the embracing of remote patient monitoring, for example, and with video consultations. There is this momentum now to embrace some of this remote technology to improve the efficiencies, both for clinical care, but also for research in general.
Thanks, James. And Hannah, do you want to add something to that?
Yeah, I was just going to add that I think that's exactly right in terms of remote monitoring and it being part of the future. And there's definitely a place for remote monitoring and combination with patient-reported outcomes. So you understand objectively how far a patient has walked, and then you understand subjectively what that meant to them. For example, were they more fatigued? Were they able to get to the shops? Was that very meaningful? You can have that combination of subjective and object data that gives you a far more complete picture of a patient's life. So just wanted to add that there.
I suppose it's also a nice time to address the trust issue, because there is so much data we can collect. I mean, DataSavesLives initiative was established because there's a lot of misunderstanding about how health data is collected, what's in place from a regulatory and protection standpoint to safeguard people's privacy and the consequences of sharing health information just like any other information. For us, data has had its moment driven by social media, etc., to the point where actually trust is broken down, but health has been behind that curve. So we're joining at this point where there's incredible public distrust about how commercial organizations share data. What do you think we can do about that in terms of multi-stakeholder organizations and initiatives like today to help address that and build that trust, and what, if shared responsibly and with those safeguards in place, is a hugely beneficial thing for the future? And Alex, you've got your hand up. I don't know if this is a question that you want to answer, or whether you want to kick us off with your thoughts on how we build trust.
Oh no, it's just an additional comment in that we held a meeting once on, we have a website called My Health Apps where we curate health apps. And this was done in conjunction with the UK government, and we had a number of patient groups there. And what was very interesting is that when you are collecting data on apps, it's also very important to distinguish between those who wish to share and those who don't wish to share. So for example, we had a patient group who was an HIV patient group. It was very important to them that all their data was extremely confidential. They didn't really see major benefits from sharing data. Whereas a person from a cystic fibrosis group stood up and said, I'll share everything because what I want is a treatment to improve my situation. And so there is a different sort of willingness among the different disease areas about data sharing. And that nuance, I don't think is that prevalent in, well, I don't know, James may be able to say, but that is really quite appreciated, how people and patients differ in what they want to share and what they don't want to share. That's all I wanted to say, sorry.
That's absolutely right. And I think from our perspective, we do not share any data without our users' permission, because fundamentally it is their data. All we are doing is facilitating that sharing with research organizations that they want to work with. And so in your instance, it would be if that is a cystic fibrosis sufferer who desperately wants to be cured, we will facilitate that for them, as opposed to our users who are HIV positive who may not. Then they wouldn't self-register into those studies and trials. So I think that's absolutely spot on. It's actually an area we haven't looked at, but it definitely will do, about what kind of personas or groups of patients tend to want to engage with research and what don't, and see if that overlaps, Hannah, with some of your hard to target rare diseases. But definitely my experience in biotech always was the rare disease patients were unbelievably keen to get into research studies. But yeah, I'm not sure if that's been your experience, Hannah.
I think it all comes down to the unmet need that exists in the space. And so in rare diseases where there is unmet need or perhaps fewer trials, then of course more potential interest in taking part in research. And I think just coming back to this idea about data sharing, and from a clinical trials perspective, it's intrinsically linked to the information and consent form and exactly what the patient agrees to in terms of the study, the data collection and appropriate data sharing, because the patient is the owner of their data, ultimately, going back to what James and Alex were describing. So that's all outlined in the ICF, and there are more and more efforts to make sure that these summaries are readily understandable. So patient lay summaries of information, and of course the opportunity to ask as many questions as is needed to understand any privacy or confidentiality or other questions that patients have. That is a key part of the information and consent process. Thanks,
Hannah. And in terms of how an audience member has just asked about the relationship with clinicians, and I suppose actually they're an audience that we haven't discussed so much in the context of this. If you're a healthcare professional who's treating a patient who is now recording a lot more information, what is the role there in terms of having to catch information at its early stage in order to prevent disease? How does greater health data sharing implicate the clinician, I suppose, is the point that I'm trying to make from your perspective in terms of managing conditions, not necessarily in the setting of clinical research? James, that might be one for you from a primary care perspective in particular.
Yeah, and the reason I'm smiling is it's something we're desperate to do, because health checks, again, as an example, is we can return to the clinician every single data field they require to complete their NHS health check. However, we also have a huge amount of information, very detailed information on diet and exercise and sleep and community and other elements which we believe are very key determinants of health, but aren't currently required to submit that health check to the NHS. So our approach very much is we hold that in the personal health record, which we want the GP to be able to access with the patient's consent, and indeed often by the patient showing their record, with a view that one day those things will be taken into account when you do a health check. And in fact, just getting GPs aware through dashboards about how things like diabetes are not just related to BMI, which they are very strongly in our data, but they're also very strongly related to things like happiness and anxiety. And I think this becomes especially true on a public health level when you start looking at deprivation and targeting communities which have poor health outcomes and historically have poor uptake with things like health checks, and being able to target those checks so they actually get to these much needed communities.
Thanks, James. And I suppose the same question to you, Hannah, in terms of investigators in clinical trials. What are the perceptions that you've heard of these self-reported tools? Is there a general acceptance that yes, we're all working towards a better future now if we involve patient-reported outcomes in their care?
I think it really depends on the indication, often, because PROs are clearly more suitable in some indications than others. But where they are suitable and patients can self-report, then absolutely there is an interest in collecting this data in conjunction with other outcomes from clinical perspectives. And clinicians are involved in this process as well, in helping us to understand the data that we get back and the data that's generated. We do always try with patient-reported outcomes to use the patient's language. That is a really key part of developing items, that it's the patient's language that is used. But of course, patients might use many different terms or ways of describing a specific concept, and you have to ultimately select one and really focus on the one that is most true and core to the disease. And that's where we can try get clinical perspective. So clinicians are definitely involved in this process as well. Just outside of clinical trials, thinking about clinical practice, I would just add that there are patient-reported outcomes that are used and are really important in this space that we might not use in the context of a trial, but might be really important for patients in a real-world setting. And they might have different evidentiary standards or different validation requirements. So I'm thinking about concepts like work productivity or other concepts that are really important in real world practice that can be captured in other patient reported outcomes. And I think they're incredibly important too, as well as the ones that I've been describing for use in clinical trials.
Thanks, Hannah. Such a good point to make, because of course these patient-reported outcomes, we have been talking in research, but the application beyond that and everything from clinical management to public health campaigns that we've discussed is huge. I suppose I might ask one final question of each of you as a kind of summary before we wrap up. And of course, if there are any final questions from the audience, then please do share them now. But my question that I like to ask is, if we were holding this webinar in 10 years' time, where would you like to see the topic of conversation having moved from an industry perspective, from a patient group perspective, and from that academic perspective that you each represent? So Hannah, I might come to you to kick off. So we're now in 2031 and we're having a webinar on how patient-reported outcomes have shaped meaningful interventions. What would you like to be the order of the day?
Great question, and a huge question. So, I think where we're going is really around this combination of data, as we've touched a lot upon today. Patient-reported outcomes are a key piece of the understanding and the jigsaw, but it's the PROs in conjunction with the other outcomes that I think provides the richest insights. So that combination of subjective and object data that I was describing before, it would be great to see more evidentiary standards around the objective wearable data and how we can integrate most effectively at subjective and objective data. So I think that's what I would say as being the future, and clearly the continued good efforts that have been made around integration of patients in every part of the journey, and not just outcomes, but across the clinical trial or the clinical life cycle. I'd hope that continues and even expands further.
Thanks, Hannah. Absolutely agreed. Hopefully it goes without saying that it's a part of all those clinical research processes in future, complementary to existing standards, but to see them elevated in terms of status for regulatory approval. Alex, if I come to you, and where you think your patient groups will be reporting on how potentially the industry does in this space, but other partners, where would you like to see us in 10 years?
Well, it's quite amusing because 20 years ago, I wrote a book called 21st Century Miracle Medicine. And this was when I was at The Economist. And it was all about how electronics and the consumer at the center, and the world was going to change with telemedicine. And you look 20 years later and nothing has really very much changed, marginal. So I would be hopeful that it would be a bit better in the next 20 years. But I think there are two conflicting issues here. One is that the patients and the patient groups want to be treated as equal with the other healthcare stakeholders around the table. So that often we had feedback that said, yes, well, we make these contributions about how things should be done, but we are not, our voice isn't treated as an equal, say, to a clinician who's had all this experience and all this time at university or whatever they have done. And so there is a real willingness for the patient to be involved, but only if they're respected and that they are treated as equal partners. On the other hand, there is also the fear by patients that the whole thing goes electronic and the humanity and the electronics override, there's a lack of humanity, the electronics override, and the whole way that patients like also to be face-to-face with their clinicians is lost. So there are these two conflicting, I suppose, trajectories. So how it ends in 20 years, who knows? But one would hope it would be a nice balance between the two.
Thanks, Alex. No, agreed. James might have an interesting perspective on whether the app interface is going to replace face-to-face healthcare in 10 years' time. What do you think we'll be seeing?
Yeah, I think there is always going to be a need for human interaction, and it's just about recognizing how expensive and in certain circumstances, like during a global pandemic, prohibitive that becomes, and basically just rationing what resources we have as a society to target that to those face-to-face interactions. But in answer to your question, and I would love to see a world where, for both the clinical guidance and the resulting cycles, but also for drug development and research, we rely more on real world data and real world evidence, have a much more fluid research cycle, a much more efficient research cycle, which hopefully in turn will drastically decrease the R&D costs to putting new drugs on the market, making those drugs much more accessible to a wider proportion of the population, and also start to shine a light on things that can't be packaged and sold and are more lifestyle related changes that we can all do irrespective of our socioeconomic backgrounds to improve our health well before we start evolving any kind of diseases or pathology. And I do think, and it's very funny, Alex, you saying you predicted a lot of this 10, 20 years ago, but that was definitely my experience in the NHS, is often things were very slow to change. But I do think in the last 12 to 18 months, I have seen more change than I have for my entire career on the back of a changing perspective with COVID. So I am quietly optimistic that things will start heading in that direction. Well,
thank you all. A huge thanks for such interesting presentations today that were all so intercomplementary on this issue of how we can take patient-reported outcomes forward, what is their value, and where do we see the future, just to touch upon there. Just a little bit more about the webinar and DataSavesLives. So we run these bi-monthly or quarterly, so watch this space for future webinars. And when we say this space, we've got a list of what those spaces are. So we've got the website of datasaveslives.eu, we have a Twitter handle, an Instagram handle, a Facebook handle, and of course we also have our project team email address. So a huge thanks for everyone who's participated and asked such fantastic questions as well. You've made my job easy in terms of keeping the conversation going, but also to our expert panelists who were ready to jump in at any moment. This recording will be made available on our website. We'll also break it down in chapters so you can see the individual presentations if you wanted to catch that, or if you're joining late and happen to miss the early ones, as well as some of the discussion. I see there are a couple of questions that have just come through, so if you don't mind, because we're close to the end, what we're going to do is probably address that in a summary blog that we can include at the end, which is just looking at some of the horizontal scanning pieces on what is the increasing policy surrounding PROs and how they're going to be a fundamental part of research moving forward and what's being done in the space at a European level. So that's one that we'll come back to in our blog form or in the many editorial spaces that we cover. So watch the space, and thank you for that question. But yes, just to round off, a huge thank you to everyone. We hope you enjoyed today's session. We certainly did, and hope that we can have many more that are as rich as this.